Good evening, everyone. Late Night Mega here, and I'm back with an update for Blue Moon. So this is the list that we played, or that I played rather, on Tuesday night, and I also took the same list Friday night just to get a really good feel for the deck and changes I wanted to make. Plus Tuesday night we only had 3 rounds, so uh, I'm going to try and make this a quick tournament recap. Round 1 I played against Kiki Cord. Game 1 I couldn't. He could cast all his chords under Blood Moon because he had Wall of Roots out. He had his basic forest, and I could never. I never had either mana for a counter open because I tapped out to play something like P and Kira or something like that, or I just didn't have the counter for the chords. So eventually he ended up going really wide and ended up winning. I did have a Vidalcan Shackles on the board that kind of helped, but once he went super wide and I was really low on life, it just didn't matter. I was able to steal his Sun Titan on the final turn, but he had like 5 other creatures coming at me and I was at like 1 life. So, like I said, it didn't matter. Game 2, he had a Voice of Resurgence and a Kemble out, and fortunately I managed to top deck the Anger of the Gods that came in out of the board. I felt that Anger, if it was in the main deck game 1, I could have gotten the win there, or at least stopped his board. I would have wiped his board, and I could have taken his Sun Titan. That would have been amazing. And then I ended up top decking a second Anger of the Gods a few turns later to stop his Kitchen Finks and whatever else. He was kind of not happy about that. And then Torrential Gearhulk, I did play the Blood Moon. He had his basic Forest and Plains, but he could never really get going after that. And then the Torrential Gearhulk helped close the game. Game 3, we ended up going to time. His Pride Mage, Quasali Pride Mage, killed my Gearhulk. And of course, the turn after he cast the Pride Mage, I drew Spell Snare. This will be a running theme. But basically, we ended in a draw. I ended up ending the game with Spell Snare, Remand, and a Cryptic in hand while he was just top decking for anything and not really finding much. So I still consider this a success or good showing for this deck. Round 2 I played against Jund Death Shadow with Tarmogoyf and Death Shadow, the really insane deck that's going around right now. Game 1 I remanded into a Blood Moon. Of course, I knew I was going to do that because I scryed him to the top, but still, it kind of hurt him. But he top decked the forest, basic forest, on his next turn to play his Tarmogoyf. But still, between Torrential Gearhulk and 2 Lightning Bolts, I was able to get the win. Which really surprised me because I did not expect to even get a game win against this deck, let alone get end up nearly beating this deck. Game 2, I mulliganed to 6, and I just had no way to deal with 2 Goyfs and 2 Death Shadows as we got to the mid game. Game 3, he went to 5 life, and I had the Gearhulk in hand, so I used the Cryptic to tap his 2 Goyfs to stop him from killing me, and I killed 2 of his Death Shadows with Engineered Explosives. That was a sideboard card that came in there. And he was top decking at that point as well, so he needed to draw something that turn to stop him from dying. He ended up being able to hardcast the Street Wraith to block my Gearhulk. I had a Lightning Bolt in hand, so I had so many outs. Electrolyze, I could just throw the burn at his face, another Bolt, a Snapcaster, another Cryptic. Any of those would have just instantly won me the game. Izzet Charm, I could Bolt and Izzet Charm his Street Wraith and kill it. Vidalcan Shackles, steal his Street Wraith. Actually, I'm pretty sure I sided those out. But still. So it was a super close match. I was not expecting it to be that close. I'm not upset about the loss here. Like I said, I wasn't even expecting to beat this deck, at least not the way this list currently was. So very impressed. Round 3, I played against a white-black budget aristocrats deck that was running about 4 concealed courtyards for non-basics. And so game 1, he had all his basics out, and I managed to draw all 4 blood moons. That went about as well as you expected. I still managed to drag the game out for quite a long time. He just barely squeaked a win in there, using some life drain and attacking for 1 after fatally pushing one of my Thopter tokens that was supposed to block. But there was like at least a span of 4 to 8 turns throughout the game where if I had drawn something other than a Blood Moon or a land, if I had drawn another Burn Spell or a Cryptic or a Snapcaster or a Gearhulk, I would have sealed the game away for sure. Game 2, boarded out all the Blood Moons, of course, and the Remans, and I just had tons of removal with the Anger of the Gods and stuff, and the both Shackles made it to the board, and so yeah, he didn't have a good time there. Game 3, we ended up going to time. I had a Gearhulk out and the P and Kira. I had lost the tokens, but I still had P and Kira themselves. And he happened to have a blocker on the final turn. Once again, if I could have top decked any Burn Spell or Vidalcan Shackles or Cryptic Commander, Snapcaster, I had so many outs, and I just was not getting them. Then I would have been able to attack him for lethal, but he was able to block the Gearhulk. So, I mean, overall, the deck didn't look like it did too good Tuesday night with a 0-1-2 record, but I was still happy with it, and so I still ran the list as it was. Friday night, round 1, I played against it was a rematch from the white-black aristocrats. This time Blood Moon did manage to cut him off from white for a lot longer than it probably should have, but that wasn't a reason to keep him in for game 2. I beat him 2-0 pretty handily. Round 2, Abzan mid-range. Game 1, he had all his non-basics out. All four lands were non-basics. And he had a Hierarch out, and he was tapped out because he tried to cast something that wasn't going to resolve, because I'm running 14 counters. And so then I dropped a Blood Moon on him, and I'm like, okay, he's probably not going to get out of this. He top decks his basic Swamp, and between that and the Hierarch, he's able to cast his Abrupt Decay to kill my Blood Moon. And then he also gets a Liliana of the Veil on the board. A couple turns later, I take care of that stuff. The Lily and the Hierarch are gone, and I get another Blood Moon down. And this time he's not able to remove it, and he just sits there with this basic Swamp, and I think by the end of the game he had like 6 to 8 mountains. It was kind of amusing. Game 2, I was on the draw. He got a turn 2 Anafenza the Foremost, which was really, really bad for me. Again, he went for his non-basics, just based on his hand. I was able to get the Blood Moon out. He had, 4 mountains, and that was his land. So he wasn't able to cast anything else, but I just couldn't answer the Hierarch and Anafenza combination. I had a handful of counters, which would have looked really impressive if I was on the play. Or if he didn't try a turn 2 Anafenza. So, yeah, I felt from the get-go that losing to big creatures would be an issue, and Anafenza kind of highlights that. Game 3, the Moon was mostly irrelevant as he did get his 3 basics right away. I still played a Moon when I felt it was safe, and I still had some mana open for counters and that, just to stop him from casting a Liliana. The game went fairly late game. He ended up getting 2 Lingering Souls going, got all 8 Spirit tokens on the field, and then I bounced them all when he attacked, and I used Aetherize. That was amusing. Then a little bit later he cast a Tarmogoyf, And the turn after, I drew Spell Snare, of course. I ended up not being able to find a real answer for the Goyf and lost to it a few turns later. Game 3. Oh, that was game 3. Yeah. So I ended up losing that match 1-2. Round 3, I played against a budget white Soul Sisters. He had no Sarah Ascendants, which is why it was budget. He also never had an answer for my Shackles, and I just completely stomped him. Round 4, Mardu Land Destruction. Game 1, I had to use 2 Lightning Bolts to stop his first Nahiri, and I had no way to stop his second Nahiri. I tried for a little bit. He and Kira didn't really get there because he just, threw his removal at him. And I'm going to be talking about that card in a little bit. And I never once drew a Cryptic in Game 1. I don't even know if I drew a Mana Leak in Game 1. It was kind of odd. So, yeah. Games 2 and 3 mostly played out the same way. He was short on lands both times, and both times Blood Moon cut him off from at least 1 or 2 of his colors. He's still able to cast stuff because he had a lot of mono red cards, but that was okay too. And then I was the games ended up a lot closer than I would have preferred, mainly because he still had Anger of the Gods for P and Kira. Yeah. And once you remove one of these finishers, there's not a ton of finishers left in the deck, especially when Shackles was irrelevant against him entirely. So that's something we're going to be working on adjusting. Game 3 was also kind of amusing because he ended up using Inquisition on me sometime in the early turns, and I showed him my hand, and it was like Serum Visions and then like 4 to 5 counters. Like, what do you do with that? I brought in the counter fluxes as well, just because he's Mardu, and like, what's he gonna do? He was playing Smallpox and Boom Bust, and none of that stuff ever really resolved in a relevant manner. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Round 5, Bant Eldrazi. Game 1, he had like 5 non-basics on the field. And so I dropped a Shackles, and he was able to resolve a... because I didn't have the Moon yet on the field. He resolved a Reality Smasher and a Thought-Knot Steer. I stole his Thought-Knot Steer with Shackles and blocked his Smasher. Yeah, he got to draw the card from it, but on my turn I was casting Blood Moon, and he wasn't going to be casting anything anyways. So I did that, and I also scryed the basic islands I needed to the top with Serum Vision, so I had enough basic islands to steal his Reality Smasher, and then I just beat him with his own creature. Game 2, I get somewhat of a late Blood Moon. I'm unable to kill a Thought-Knot Seer and Drowner of Hope combination, and he had Stony Silence out for my Vidalcan Shackles, because I wasn't going to keep Spell Snare in this match. I was just kind of hoping he wouldn't end up drawing it, or I could maybe bounce it at some point with Cryptic, and he can't recast it because he's under Blood Moon. Game 3, he does end up with getting his basics. Basic Forest and Basic Plains. The first Blood Moon he blows up right away with not Natural State, the one that gains me 4 life, because that was kind of nice. The second Blood Moon sticks, and I drop a third one just in case he draws another Nature's Claim. That's what it was. And he was able to drop his Stony Silence while I was doing all of that, and while I was using Bolts and Izzet Charms to kill his early Hierarchs. He gets a Reality Smasher to stick for a couple turns while I'm doing all of this and getting Blood Moon out. And then I use Aetherize to return it to his hand, and then he can't recast it because he's under Blood Moon now. So that was all kinds of amusing. And then I eventually just beat him down with, it was either P and Kira or Gear Hulk or something. I think it was the Gear Hulk. And yeah, so after my past few control decks losing to Bant Eldrazi, it feels good getting the win here with it. And so I ended up third place Friday night, so going 4-1. So yeah, big success. So P and Kira, this was the most disappointing card in the deck. It never felt like a aha, I want to draw this card, or aha, I drew P and Kira, now I'm going to win because of this. It was never really a come from behind card. I realized that two flying 1/1 Thopters can be really good against the likes of Affinity and Infect. But against what I was playing against, it was either just, hey, here's something that deals damage to you, which anything I use as a finisher is capable of doing that, or here's a few small blockers that will maybe, hopefully, block your giant Tarmogoyf for a few turns while I figure out how to deal with it. I'm going to tap 4 lands just to block your guys for a couple turns. It just felt very underwhelming. It wasn't really a come from behind card for me. There was a couple times where I was able to sack Thopters to push through the last few points of damage. It was kind of hard to cast it and sack Thopters at the same time because that cost triple red. So P and Kira would usually just die to a lightning bolt or something, or Anger of the Gods, or against Kiki Court, Orzhov Pontiff came out and killed the Thopters. It just wasn't a good time. So maybe this will come back as like a one-of in the sideboard sometime in the future against like Affinity Infect. But still, with all the burn I've got, I don't feel too bad against those matchups, and the Blood Moons for their Nexuses. Nexi, whatever. So all-star cards. Is It Charm? Is It Charm was working on overtime here. All of its modes were relevant. Not sure. I'm pretty sure I countered something with it, but mainly killing creatures, or later on in the games discarding extra Blood Moons, or discarding counter spells because I can't counter stuff, or my opponent's got so many lands that Mana Leak is irrelevant, that is, and getting to something more useful, or getting rid of extra lands. Desolate Lighthouse, same kind of situation, very useful when the Blood Moon wasn't in play. Electrolyze was also pretty good. I mean, the worst it ever does is just shoots my opponent for 2 and draws me a card, so it still helps me cycle through my deck, get me deeper, and possibly enable me for a burnout finish between Electrolyze and Bolts and the Snaps and Gear Hulks. Vidalcan Shackles. Up until the final Bant Eldrazi match, that game 1, because that was the only game it was good in, he had the Stony Silence both other games, I was ready to take this out for sure, and my opinion of it wasn't super great. It still isn't super great. Shackles was ultimately either a card that was the best card on the field, best card I could have, or it was an absolute dead card. And there was like no in between with the thing. And so, since this is kind of going in a finisher / dealing with creatures slot, I think I'm going to cut this. I really do feel like I want the Anger of the Gods, at least a couple copies in the main deck. Once again, if I don't need them in the particular match, Is It Charm can discard them. But I don't want to be playing Anger of the Gods with P and Kira in the main deck. That just doesn't feel good at all. But yeah, against like the Kiki Court, if I had Angers in the main deck, I might have won that game 1. Against the Aristocrats deck, those would have just been nice. Against creature decks in general, they would be nice to have in the main deck. Because as it is, with the main deck, the way it is here, if my opponent can go super wide on their creatures, I can't deal with that. I can't get rid of all of them. P and Kira does very little to help with that. So, yeah, there was that. 14 counters was actually pretty nice overall. I do enjoy that. I still think I'm going to cut 1 in the main deck just to make some room for other things. So a couple other issues I was having, I would like something that can like get me some more card advantage, maybe some sort of mass draw. I don't know if that would be I don't know if the correct thing would be like Glimmer of Genius or even Jace's Ingenuity or Blue Sun Zenith, something along those lines. I just want to draw a bunch of cards and just kind of refuel my hand and get ready to just completely seal the game once I get things under control. I still kind of like the spell snares. I knew dealing with large creatures was going to be an issue, and so I've been going through like a bunch of blue-red cards. Some of the things I was thinking of was Vapor Snag came to mind. I could bounce like a Tarmogoyf and then recounter it with Spell Snare. The issue is, where would I put a Vapor Snag if I was going to run like one or two in the main deck? And it would probably go in place of either a Lightning Bolt, a Spell Snare, or Remand, or an Electrolyze, and I don't really want to cut any of those for a Vapor Snag. Don't want to cut the Electrolyze or the Bolts, because Vapor Snag can, in addition to those, can also help with burning out our opponent. You know, cutting a Spell Snare so I can Vapor Snag a Goyf to Spell Snare it later just feels a little counterproductive when we're cutting a Spell Snare for that, so that seems odd. Other things I was thinking of, Turn and Burn, kind of expensive. Roast deals 5 damage to a creature for 2 mana. Really what I want is just have Wizards print a new card, make it a double red instant, and have it deal like 8 damage to a creature. That's really what this deck wants. I'll even settle for 6 or 7 damage on that. Might be a little overboard, but it's what I want. Harvest Pyre was another one, but again, you're only going to get maybe one use out of it, and people are already going to bring in Graveyard Hate when they see the Snapcasters and Gear Hulks as it is, so it gets kind of worse progressively. It could potentially hurt a Tarmogoyf taking a Blood Moon that's in my graveyard out of the graveyard, so bringing the Tarmogoyf's power down, because that would be useful. Harvest Pyre, for those who don't know, because it is such a obscure card, you probably wouldn't run this as more than a one of, because you're essentially delving cards from your graveyard to deal X damage, where X is how many cards you exiled from your graveyard. So, and it's not super good in the early game. I still feel this deck is kind of weak against like Loxodon Smiter. There was someone playing Celestia Beatdown. You know, Reality Smasher, Thought-Knot Seer. Another idea I had was Skred, which I don't know how well this would work out. Deals damage equal to number of snow permanents. We're running a ton of basics, so we could swap these and have a much more expensive mana base for Skreds. However, it still wouldn't kill the likes of a turn 2 Anafenza until at minimum turn 4. And realistically, one of my early lands that I tend to fetch for is like always a Steam Vent. So if I drop a Steam Vent, that's not a snow land. We're not killing it until turn 5 at minimum. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's really the answer, but it's a 1 mana instant. Lightning Axe was another one I kind of thought of, or even just maybe a Planeswalker like Tamiyo, the Moon Sage. That was an idea. But I also want something that helps us with our card draw situation. I did like the 14 counters, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move 2 of these Anger of the Gods to the main deck in place of the Vidalcan Shackles. We're going to remove 2 P and Kira for, well, you'll see in a little bit, and we're going to cut a Remand. While it's nice to have all these counters, with the Izzet Charms, I'm technically have like 8 2-mana counter spells here, and the Spell Snares. Remand was probably between the next card to cut down by 1 copy of is either going to be Remand, Spell Snare, Blood Moon, or Electrolyze. when Electrolyze is good, it's really good and you want that second copy of it. And its worst case scenario isn't all that bad against any deck. Blood Moon, you don't really need multiples on the field, but you know, with Is It Charm and Desolate Lighthouse, provided I don't already have a moon out, I can get rid of extra moons. And against decks that you really want the moon against, like Bant Eldrazi, you really want the moon. So I don't want to cut this down to 3 yet. Maybe I could cut it down to 3 and put the 4th in the board. I don't know if that feels... I don't know if that's right yet. So ultimately, that would leave Spell Snare or Remand. I still like the 3 Spell Snares here. There's just so many things that it seems to be answering for Blue-Red, especially answering Goyfs that are trying to be cast. So I'm going to go down a Remand because I think that is probably the worst counter in the deck. Not to say it's not great, but it's not the best thing to have lots of in this deck. So I'm going to try 2 Remands. And we're going to leave the mana base the same. I don't think I'm ready to put in Academy Runes and go with more artifacts in the main deck. You know, there were still times where, like, if I drop a Blood Moon on turn 3, one of my lands is only going to produce red. So if that's a Steam Vents, I could have a Steam Vents and 2 basic islands. I could struggle with finding, sometimes take a few turns to find another basic island, even though we've got 10 of them, because now our fetch lands don't really work anymore, and these are just going to be mountains. That's going to be a mountain. So there were a couple times where I spent a few turns unable to cast Cryptic Command, but when you really needed a turn 3 Blood Moon, you really need a turn 3 Blood Moon. But if I add another land to it, chances are, if I add Academy Runes, chances are the land that gets cut will be a basic island, so I'm not really ready to do that yet. In the sideboard, our sideboard all-star card of the night was Aetherize, bouncing a horde of tokens and also bouncing a Reality Smasher that my opponent could not recast due to Blood Moon. That was just really amusing. I'm going to hang on to the Dragon's Claw. I don't feel like any of the rounds I lost or came close to losing that just a pure life gain card like this would help the situation. And so, well, with 2 Angers going to the main deck, I'm also going to cut a Surgical Extraction. I just don't feel that it was as good here as elsewhere, because essentially I probably have to counter or kill something before I can Surgical it. I ended up using a Surgical in the Mardu land destruction match against my opponent's Anger of the Gods. He played 1 already, or I countered 1 with Mana Leak already. I had P and Kira out with the tokens, beating him down. I remanded another one, so he didn't have the mana to recast it, so then I Surgicaled it. And why do I have to Surgical my opponent's Anger of the Gods, a card that I'm playing? It just feels so wrong for what we're doing here. So yeah, that's some of the ideas bouncing around in my head. Other things to answer big creatures, Wormcoil Engine. That answers big creatures fairly well. However, it is still kind of weak to Path to Exile, as is Torrential Gearhulk, and I don't have a really good way of countering Path to Exiles. So I don't want to add another one, at least to the main deck, of things that lose to Path to Exile. So I have some ideas for some things I want to try out. I'm also going to cut one of the Surgicals. I'll hang on to 1. I also had a hard time boarding them in, like figuring out what to take out when I want to bring these in. So yeah, I'm going to try it as a one-of. We'll see where that goes. And I'll show you where we're currently at with the deck. Oh gosh, I have been recording for almost a half hour already. Okay, and here is the list we're ending up at, taking out 5 cards from the main deck. Lone Revenant. This, at least on paper, seems to be the answer to replacement for P and Kira. It has hexproof. It's a 4/4, so it's not going to die to my own Anger of the Gods. In fact, the fact that it doesn't makes it work really well with Anger of the Gods. And its effect here is when it deals combat damage to a player if I have no other creatures. Look at the top 4 cards of my deck. Basically, I get an impulse. One of them goes to my hand. So it's card advantage, card selection. It can really help me, in theory, just bury my opponent and put the game away. That's the goal. And what kills this thing anyways? Mass removal and sacrifice effects, which sacrifice effects like Blessed Alliance and stuff, that's just going to get countered by Spell Snare. Mass removal will either get countered, or if it's uncounterable like Supreme Verdict, you gotta have double white in order to cast it, and decks running Supreme Verdict are probably decks I'm going to be playing or keeping Blood Moon against, so they'll have to try and cast that under a Blood Moon, which I don't see that happening, at least not very easily. Other than that, he'll probably die in combat, which that'll be sad. But, yeah, he can stop most. 4/4 is kind of a nice-sized body. I wish it was 4/5, though, so it could win in combat against, like, Lockstone Smiter, Thought Not Seer, and at least bounce off of Tasigur. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Keranos is also coming in. He's another card advantage engine, and there's not many things that can remove him. He can also help get our opponent into burn range, or we can just burn him out with bolts and electrolyzes and stuff. Also, he can kind of double up with a lightning bolt or an Anger of the Gods to deal 6 damage to a creature without really costing me card advantage, so it can kind of help me against big creatures as well. I doubt I'll ever have the Devotion. I mean, it is possible with Snapcasters, Lone Revenants, Gearhulks, and also the Blood Moons will help with the Devotion, but I guess by that point, you know, I know he died a Path to Exile, but if I have all that stuff on the field, and I'm attacking with him, yeah, I'm probably winning anyways. Lone Revenant, you know, I don't have a ton of other creatures, and Keranos isn't going to be a creature when it's on the field anyways, so there's some nice synergy there, if you can call it that, I guess. So yeah, I'm excited to try this out. It's a hexproof finisher. I love hexproof finishers. The other problem this guy might have is being blocked on the ground, but once again, you know, what ground blockers are really going to get through, you know, all the burn encounters I have and still be cast under Blood Moon? So hopefully this guy can help me with the card advantage and with providing a decent finisher. We did cut one of the remands, so we'll see. We're down to 13 counters, which is still a lot more than I think any of my previous decks. But we can get away with that because this is blue-red, and we don't have a bunch of things that can just spot kill any creature like Path to Exile or things like that. So we get to run more counters. In the sideboard, I haven't changed mana base. In the sideboard, you know, with 2 of the Angers, I still want the 3rd Anger because against decks where we want Anger, we really want to have access to the Angers. The exiling effect is so nice, especially against things like Voice of Resurgence, Dredge, Kitchen Finks, all things that I don't really like dealing with. And I don't want to be completely dead in the water against them game 1, so I do feel that it's a good thing to have a couple in the main deck. I'm going to try out Roast for the killing big stuff. It can kill Smiters early game, it can kill Tasigur, Thought Not Seer, Reality Smasher. Yeah, I'll have to discard a card for that one, but it still gives me an out to it. And it can kill Goyfs that haven't gone super crazy with their power and toughness yet. And I'm also going to try out a Worm Coil engine. It kind of also does good at dealing with big creatures, with the death touch and everything. Lifelink is always welcome, and yeah, it can also act as another finisher as well. Probably don't want to be bringing this in against white decks because they'll have the Path to Exiles, but other than that, it's probably good to go. And so I'm going to run the deck like this. I know this part went way long, way longer than what I initially said it was going to, but I mean, this journey or this Blue Moon deck is supposed to be a bit of a different sort of thing. You're seeing all of my in-between steps rather than just seeing my finalized product. So I hope you guys enjoyed, my explanations and card choices and all of that, and just the way my mind works. Another thing I was thinking of during this process, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but Treasure Mage can also search up either Torrential Gearhulk or Worm Coil Engine. Not that I'm anywhere close to trying that, because I don't feel I have a lot of wiggle room in here with still wanting to keep all of these nice counters. But that's just something to ponder on. Yeah, that's the deck. That's where we're at. If the roasts don't work out, like I said, I've listed at least 4 or 5 other options. If I ever do want to go wide again, I can look at Metallurgic Summonings or Young Pyromancer, but when I'm running Lone Revenant, those don't seem good to have for obvious reasons. But yeah, a lot of times I found myself not really having too many creatures on the field. And a lot of times I'd cast P and Kira with no creatures on my field, so just replace that with a Lone Revenant, and we can start going to town on that. And yeah, I'm going to try this out next Tuesday and Friday, and I'll report back to you after that.